Welcome to SIM-PAC Live. I'm your host, Jeff Matthews. Today we have a panel to discuss ASPiRE 5.0, which aims to unlock productivity with technology and ESG to take advantage of Australia's natural trade opportunity. I would like to welcome our panellists. Alan O'Connor, ASPiRE 5.0 Project Lead, Sea-Edge, University of South Australia, Business. Susan Stone, Credit Union South Australia, Chair of Economics, University of South Australia, Business. James Veerley, Managing Director, APAC123carbon.com. Costa Casio, Spinfra, Managing Director. And Kanan Govardhan, Director, Centre for Sustainable Operations and Resilient Supply Chains, University of Adelaide. Welcome, good people.
Hello there, Jeff. How are you going?
I'm going great. How are you all
Nice
today?
to be here. Good.
Good.
Thanks.
We're good.
Yep.
Good. Very well, thank you.
Great. Looking forward to our chat. Alan, for those who may not be familiar, can you paint us a picture of what ASPiRE 5.0 is all about and why is now the right time for this kind of initiative?
Jeff, that's a really interesting question. And to answer that, I'd say now is not the right time. The right time was yesterday. So there's an imperative around this that is need to be appreciated. ASPiRE 5, people might be familiar with the term Industry 4.0. That idea of Industry 4.0 started a few years back and was really directed towards driving industry productivity. A few years back, my background is basically engineering. I now sit at the University of South Australia as a professor of enterprise dynamics. And what that means is I'm really interested in the way businesses, technology, societies are changing and evolving. So going back to my roots, I started to talk to our STEM colleagues, science, technology, engineering, maths colleagues, and started to think about, well, where is these technologies taking us as a business? And we started some work around Industry 4.0. And finishing a project around that, we started to think about, well, Industry 4.0 has taken this pathway of really improving production, which is a fair business case, right? There's nothing wrong with it. But what we also realised is we started to think about, well, what's next? Where is this taking us? We looked at the idea of Industry 5.0, which we could see coming out of Europe. We could see Japan talking about Japan as Society 5.0. And then we also looked at the US and we saw their strategic posturing around technology and the advances of technology in gaining environmental advantages. Whilst we could see all this coming, we thought Industry 4 is not actually answering this question. We need more to this. So how do we do this? So we actually turned to Europe, tried to get a solution there. We thought, Europe's talking about Industry 5. They must have actually advanced on this agenda. And we quickly learned when we were there to sort of say that these companies in Europe are struggling with similar issues. What is this Industry 5? How do we bring society and environment into the question of this technology adoption? So we didn't get the answers we were looking for there, but we did get collaborators. And so it was interesting to sort of say there's a group out there that's really interested in how we bring technology into this Industry 5, where the humanity becomes central to what we do. So that's where Industry 5 is taking us. That's what it's about, bringing humanity into the equation as we think about new technologies and the adoption of new technologies in this business productivity sense.
Just coming back to Industry 4.5, I can remember giving a speech in Milan in 2019 on Industry 4.0 and the Internet of Things. Did we ever really get there with 4.0? I mean, is 5 just because we failed to implement 4.0 quickly enough, or it didn't do the job?
No, we are talking about industry evolutions, right? So it's not like you flick a switch and go from 4 to 5, so or 3 to 4 for that matter. And certainly in many cases, we see that the industries are struggling with this journey. There are some that are well down this journey. They've already taken those steps. But there are others that are going, hang on a minute, we're not there yet, and we still need to actually think about those evolutions. And that evolution is becoming more and more critical to embrace. I mean, most of us on this panel are from South Australia. We see what's happening on the coasts with the algal blooms. We hear last night about the coral bleaching. These ocean temperatures are rising. We have more severe crises. We know resources on this planet are limited. There are things that we need to take steps towards, and technology can help us do that. And I think businesses are moving into moving in this direction as part of the evolution. It's not a missing the bus. We're all still on this bus, and we're on this journey together.
When you talk about Industry 5.0 and Society 5.0, those are terms that sound futuristic to many people. But how close are we to seeing them in action in Australia?
You're right. In many ways, it is futuristic to many companies because they really haven't yet started to grapple with these things. But as I alluded to before, there are many that are already on this journey. And the ASPiRE 5 project is really engaging with industries, different industries. And as we talk to industries, we find people at different points, which is absolutely fine. So is it futuristic? Yes, it is for many. But there are many that are already on this path. So when to your question around where are we on this, in this evolution, it is the next business decision away, basically. You can think about this as something that, it's not going to happen to me, it's way off into the future. But the fact is, as businesses take responsibility for this, governments will either start to drive us in this direction if we don't take responsibilities at a business level. But for a business, it's a decision to be made if you haven't already made it, but is certainly on the minds of many of those leading businesses who are already adopting technologies. And we're talking to people, and we know businesses are thinking about how do we use these technologies to gain on those multiple dimensions, not just on our productivity and economic gain, but at the same time lift our environmental performances and our social responsibilities. So if it's not there for some, it is there for others. So we're on that evolution.
Susan, you've been tracking export markets closely. What's changed recently that's pushing ESG and industrial transformation to the top of the agenda for Australian businesses?
Well, I think it isn't so much recently. I think that it has been building for a long period of time. We've seen, especially in the ESG space, the idea of socially responsible businesses, tracing supply chains, being a corporate citizen, and these kinds of issues, as they've become more important to consumers, businesses have realized that they can get a competitive edge by saying they have responsibly sourced material, or even firms. Like we see that, for example, recently in Australia, Kmart has been, there's been some legal action from Kmart to actually prove that their supply chains are being sourced from non-slave labor and these issues. And because supply chains are global, this is a global phenomenon, and this is definitely impacting the way businesses organize themselves and where they source their material. And they're being increasingly called to account on these issues.
How transparent do you think these supply chains are now? Are they getting better? Because there was a point, and I said famously on an interview, that no one's got transparency across their supply chain unless they owned it vertically.
That's right. It is. There are policies being put in place. Very few of them are binding. Most of them are best practice or belonging to international organizations such as the OECD or the UN, and you sign up to these pledges and you do quote unquote the best you can, and you try to make these issues transparent, but it really can be impossible when there are suppliers of suppliers of suppliers. You want to support local You want to help, businesses in developing countries get started. You don't always know what's going on in every factory or every supply chain business. And so it's difficult. I have to say it's improving. And there's much global pressure on businesses to be held to account, but actually any binding or like financial penalties other than potentially losing shareholders for some big incident, it's really difficult to hold these companies to account across an entire supply chain.
Yes, I recently interviewed a lady, Vanessa Richards from Queensland, who's a global supply chain expert, and I was impressed that she was actually getting in the plane and going to these factories in Southeast Asia on behalf of clients.
Yes.
Are you seeing more of that?
Yes, you do. You see more of that wanting documentation, being called in. Even when I worked for the UN, we often went and visited different factories and tried to investigate what was going on in some supply chains from a human rights perspective and these kinds of things. But businesses themselves are, as I said, they're becoming under increasing pressure to be accountable for their supply chains. Now, that as is it's not only coming from these international organizations and consumers, but also, as I said earlier, I think it does give them a competitive edge. I mean, we saw early in this whole game with like the tuna and the turtles, the tuna fishing and turtles getting caught in the net, and those companies, those tuna companies that could legitimately claimed that they had no turtles killed in their fishing or their tuna was sustainably harvested, they were able to charge a couple extra pennies on a can of tuna fish, and consumers were happy to pay it because they wanted to support this behavior. So this idea of using sustainability, using good corporate practice, using social outcomes as a triple bottom line, if you will, in order to improve profitability, has really been gaining momentum by many big companies.
Yes, as long as the statements on the can of tuna are correct, and it's all also where government come into play. If you're going to give me a visual pie chart on the percentage of what's driving it, where would you have the percentage of government policy, customer expectations, and competitive pressure?
Oh, I'd say about 20 years ago, it was probably a lot of government policy, because these issues are, what we call externalities, right? So their costs and their benefits aren't always accurately captured by market prices. And therefore, a lot of governments come in and they put regulation on, and that is supposed to correct for externalities. But as as Alan said, the algal bloom, let's say in South Australia, that's happening right now, and what's happening to businesses along that way, it's in their interest to make sure that environmental standards, let's say, are actually applied and enforced. And so now businesses are starting to become more proactive. So I'd say where before it was, maybe 70% government, it's now government's probably about 30, and the consumer is now getting much more concerned about this. Now, a lot of people argue that the ESG from a business perspective is a luxury good. So it's really consumers in developed markets like Australia and the EU and the US that really demand these standards be put in place. But there's a whole growing consumer markets in the developing world that may not be as interested or be able to care or enforce these, put the public pressure on companies enough. So if we look at the global pie, we would hope that's probably going to still be more government led than consumers. And we hope that consumer pressure, because that's really what gets businesses to act, really starts to spread globally.
Yes, look, there's one question I ask every ESG practitioner that comes on my show, and it's that, and I'll spring it on you, is that with our reporting in Australia, and I love our reporting, and it's our tier one reporting,
Yep.
Is there a fear that ESG has now been captured by the lawyers and accounting, auditing, and there's no sustainability people in the room when they're having those conversations?
It is that is a legitimate concern, I think, because well, what's happening? It's interesting because as you want to hold companies to account and you want to have a similar standard, legal, regulatory, and accounting standards and consistency and agreed to principles on how things are going to be reported are absolutely essential. You know, we don't want greenwashing. We don't want companies to act in a superficial way. We want to ensure there's some consistency and rigor behind the reporting standards. So it is absolutely essential that they are really a critical part of the whole process. But they need to understand through the sustainability entry how what the goals are and what that's going to look like. And so there does need to be consistent and meaningful interaction in that process. But they all have their different expertise, and of course whenever that happens you sometimes get lost in the weeds when you're trying to come up with these things. This is definitely happening at the global level. You have a lot of discussion. The UN's been working to try to get, you know, global standards for accounting across these issues for a long time, but it is a long process.
Yes, I'm hoping that it's only a temporary phase, that
Yeah.
we're doing this reporting and legals in the room, and we're doing the bare minimum that we have to do it legally, and then at some stage we get past that hurdle and we actually start to make some traction.
Yeah.
James, you've got a dual perspective with your head office in Europe. Where do you see the biggest gaps or opportunities for Australian companies to leap ahead rather than play catch up?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think the main difference between Australian markets and EU markets is the amount of ESG regulation that we have in EU that we just don't have in Australia. I consult with a lot of Australian companies. In fact, I was in Melbourne with a major packaging company last week, talking about their ESG strategy, their strategy for lower carbon packaging products. The bottom line was in Australia, they don't have to conform to anything. I mean, we do have mandatory carbon financial related disclosures now in Australia since the start of this year, but they really, you know, show us what your scope 1, 2, and 3 is. When we compare that more with what Europe has, which is much more, you know, not only show us, but how are you going to reduce over a period of time? So I think there is an opportunity for Australia to inherit some of the good regulation practice. I mean, no one likes regulation. You know, a lot of the conversations I had with this company were, it's a cost, and do our customers really, you know, want it and benefit from it, especially in these times when, you know, everyone's purses are tight and, you know, you could argue that going green is a luxury if you're paying a few cents more for everything. It all adds up. I mean, we need to get to the point where industry is green by nature, is ESG compliant by nature, that doesn't cost a premium. We're certainly in that transition period today, where, you know, early adopters do have to pay, you know, for the extra processes involved. And they don't always see the upside from that. They don't see that they can charge more. So I think we need to look to see what Europe has done in terms of regulations. I mean, regulations certainly force people's hands. You know, if you're not going to do it on a voluntary market, you're going to do it because regulations say. It's interesting. A lot of companies who do export into Europe out of Australia have to conform today. Things like Fuel EU Maritime. You know, I was working with one of our big miners. Their vessels going into European ports have to show they have so much biofuel and are compliant. There's a cross-border adjustment mechanism that can give you an advantage if you can already show that you have a lower carbon product, then you don't need to pay those fees. So there's definitely upside and opportunity. I would see adopting some of the best practices from the EU, but also having an attractive voluntary market where, you know, a company can really say, we've gone the extra mile and we can be recognized for that be it some sort of credits with the government, or certainly in marketing to their products to the public. If we rely on regulation alone, we're just going to move as quick as the regulation moves, and I think we need to move quicker.
Yes, and certainly things like tendering for large infrastructure projects and things like that, those requirements that are going to be put into those tenders are going to help drive behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a bit. I keep thinking, here we are in South Australia. We got an abundance of high quality iron ore. We've got an abundance of renewable power, and yet we still can't seem to get a green steel plant going or green hydrogen going at scale. And it's a little bit sad, really. We, of all the places in the world, okay, we're a little bit far from the markets, but we got this wonderful ecosystem that's geared up to make us the leaders, and we're still squabbling around, not being able to find a way through. It'll happen, but it should have happened, to Alan's point, 4 or 5 years back.
Yeah, thank you. Costa, technology and transformation, it always sounds exciting, but they often come with a price tag. If you were sitting across from a skeptical CEO who reports to a board, who report to shareholders, what's the strongest case you'd make for investing now rather than waiting?
Yeah, great question, Jeff. From my perspective, it's all about opportunity cost and being efficient with the time that we have and being smart in how we can adapt technology into optimizing our current operations and looking into the future in how we could remain relevant. As we can all appreciate, we're in a very transient environment at the moment where there's a lot of change, a lot of noise, and a lot of discussion around what companies should be doing. And what I'm seeing predominantly at the niche level is an element of anxiety and overwhelmness around, are we missing out and are we falling behind the 8 ball here around being able to stay relevant? So the key message for me, Jeff, is very much around business as usual, creating stability, and very much implementing simple and basic technological improvements to get you to a point where you're still relevant in the market today.
Yes, I mean, you and I, we've chatted on the show before, and I'm an advocate for the low-hanging fruit, for doing today what's readily available, because some of it, especially with renewable energy, is actually cost effective. It will save you money almost immediately. You can do it out of OPEX. And there's a lot of companies have been featured on the show that have done remarkable things because instead of looking way down the track at the hard to abate sectors, the stuff you can do now that makes your operations more efficient and better. I know that you help companies like that. Are you seeing more and more that the drive towards using, especially renewable energy, that the investment is able to be recouped quite quickly?
I do, Jeff. I think the key thing that we're seeing in the market at the moment is very much around access to capital and then how that capital is best used. So when we look at, what defines a low-hanging fruit opportunity, it's very much around driving efficiencies within current state of play, as opposed to implementing new initiatives that require either a step change in how they operate or, secondary to that, seeking capital to be able to enable those changes. So it's very much a chicken and egg situation at the moment, especially down the curve with those that aren't as well funded. And what we're seeing is those that are making an investment, whether it's in the renewable space or an offsetting space, they are doing it incrementally. So they're investing small amounts of money over periods of time. They're wanting to see what that return on investment looks like in their businesses so that they can assess in how they then spend that next phase of money. So it's very much dependent on how large these businesses are. Those at the top end where money may not be as much of a factor as opposed to the social economical elements of them enacting these changes. We're seeing that they're a lot more active in the market in how they're going about implementing these changes. However, down the curve, it seems like those that are a lot smaller are struggling to understand where they should spend the limited funds that they have available. So we're supporting that part of the market at the moment in very much guiding them around how to best spend that capital and also how to best source that capital to allow them to stay relevant and contribute to the social economic benefits around ESG and other energy related thematics around that decarbonisation story.
Thank you. Kanan, when we talk about ESG and tech, people often think about what happens inside their own business, but you focus on supply chains. Where are the biggest wins hiding there?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. When people talk about ESG and Industry 5.0, they often focus on what happens inside their own walls, such as like reducing the energy use, managing the waste, improving the workforce well-being. But when it comes to more sector or most of the sectors, the biggest ESG footprint and the biggest opportunities sit in the supply chains. Let's dive with respect to some of the small examples. Like let's take a food retail sector where over 80% of its carbon emission comes from farming, processing, and transport, not the store itself. By working with farmers, we can also adapt some regenerative practices, switching to lower carbon transport modes, and by improving their cold chain efficiency, yet cut the emissions while improving the product quality and so on. So here you can see like how the whole value chain is involved rather than focusing on their own businesses and so on. Another example we can see is in terms of manufacturing could be redesigning the products with suppliers. So components are modular and recyclable, keeps materials in a circulation and reduces the raw material risks. So when you join everything, what happens is that the common thread is collaboration, coordinating with the suppliers, logistics partners, and even the competitors to tackle the shared ESG challenges and so on. So when we look into everything, that's where I can see the Industry 5.0 human technology partnership really scales the impacts when it comes to the supply chain focus and so on.
How do you see Australian supply chains becoming more resilient and transparent through these changes?
When we bring these two aspects together, like ESG and Industry 5.0, mainly we are also dealing with achieving this human centricity, resilience, and then sustainability together for the betterment of like ESG performances and so on. So what happens in terms of the Australian industries is that Australian supply chains are becoming more resilient and transparent by pairing these ESG goals with Industry 5.0 technologies and collaboration models. Let's see in agriculture, we also use some platforms like Agri-Digital, which uses the blockchain to track the grains from farm to export terminal, giving the farmers and buyers instant proof of origin and quality. So this builds the coordination aspects as well as the trust in export markets and speed up the payments and so on. And another example we can look into in the logistics sector is the port operators are integrating the real-time tracking with predictive maintenance, predictive analytics. So containers can reroute quickly if weather or biosecurity checks or transport bottlenecks occurs and so on. So by combining the transparency tools like collaborative risk management, Australian supply chains can respond faster to stocks and then disruptions in the supply chains, meeting the rising ESG expectations and strengthening their competitive advantage in the global market and so on. So I see a positive trend going on with the Australian supply chains where we can look into this as a collaborative actions.
Do you think the smaller players benefit from being in a collaborative supply chain? I mean, Costa talked about those lower down the pole, and and we understand it's difficult for those people to have access to capital to make large changes. But I would have thought that if they're part of a supply chain, we all like being part of teams. It would be easier to contribute or see where their little bit of their contribution is actually playing a role in the bigger picture.
When it comes to the smaller players, or when we consider some of the SMEs in their supply chains, what happens is that, okay, when we try to integrate the ESG as well as the Industry 5.0, first you need to think about whether they are ready to implement those Industry 5.0 technologies. Do they really have the need to integrate the technological aspects? And another key aspects I would look into as a challenge is how mature they are to integrate those technologies. And then another challenge would be bringing the financial feasibility of those technologies into this one. But really, it gives us the upper hand to be more competitive in their whole supply chain business.
And can you give us an example of what you're talking about, so some of the viewers don't get lost about these 5.0 technologies? Just give us an example of what a technology is that somebody in a supply chain would be using.
For example, when we talk about this Industry 5.0, the European Union definition of Industry 5.0 is you need to have a technology that fits into the human centricity. For example, you have several technologies in the previous Industry 4.0, such as like IoTs, blockchains, data-driven simulations. Then we also have digital twins and so on. But what the important focus in this Industry 5.0 is, let's take collaborative robots where the human has an interactions with human centricity in the sense like robots, where this could be used in a industrial setup which can enhance their sustainability performances in terms of like minimizing the carbon footprint and then bringing some workers social aspects, social sustainability aspects in a way that their supply chains are more resilient.
While I've got all of you here, I want to ask a question, and it's to do with what some of the ESG topic and why and would you need to start acting now? Last week I read an article that the planet is becoming uninsurable. Does anyone get a sense that we're worried about insurance, and the reason that we don't have the money to do something now? Well, it's a threat to your existence that if you don't have insurance. Has anyone seen that come through in any of the discussions?
I can talk about South Australia for a little bit. I'm sure Alan and James will have things to add, but we've been seeing, we've had, as many countries after COVID have had a big period of high inflation, cost of living. One of the largest items that has been increasing in cost has been insurance. It's really becoming a much larger share of people's budgets, household budgets, and we're seeing more and more households can't afford insurance, and we're seeing at the same time an increase in the number of weather-related events related to climate change. And so it's becoming a vicious cycle, and it has been getting play here in Australia about either you can't afford insurance, or you can't afford to rebuild after a natural disaster because you won't be able to get insurance. And the government's been having to step in a more not but an increasingly frequent way to help both businesses and households whose insurance payments haven't covered the extent of the disaster, and or who don't have insurance. And this is becoming a large talking point here in Australia for sure.
I think I can add to that. We're working with large US tech companies. This is a little bit more beyond insurance. They almost have an existential threat to their customer base view, and certainly one of the large tech companies, the household name we're working with, has put billions behind investing in other people's ESG projects. And their rationale is, if we want to remain our dominant market share, we need a market to sell into. And and look, this all sounds, terribly doomsday bookish, but it's a great view to have, because rather than sit idly by and watch it happen, they're actually putting their money where their mouth is. They're saying, we are a big American tech company, we make billions a year. How best can we deploy these funds and actually have an impact, which ultimately you could argue will also benefit them in the future if these consumers are around to buy their tech. So yeah, that's a bit of an extension to just being able to afford insurance.
I can add one thing, and it's really to think about those business dimensions with respect to the distance between the decision to make a green technology adoption, if I can put it that way, and the cost of the insurance, which sits in another part of your books.
We've still got deniers.
Yes. So you've got two parts of this equation which are not necessarily connected. But that is the essence of what the Industry 5 movement and the ASPiRE 5 kind of project is about. I don't know if I've really described what the ASPiRE 5 project is about, but it is about enabling companies, or working with companies from a university sector, to think about the technologies they're adopting, to gain in those productivity measures, but at the same time consider those environmental and social and humanity aspects of the decisions they're making. So that's what the project is about. We're trying to resource that through recruiting high degree by research students. That's what the ASPiRE project is about. But so to connect those decisions, we are talking about ecosystems now. And if you start thinking about ecosystems, this is how I got into this space. I kind of found myself thinking about entrepreneurial ecosystems. And once I started to do that, you start to realize and think about and start to grapple with the complexities, the interconnections, the systemic approaches that, a little move over here creates the windstorm down the road. How does all this connect? So in driving some of these decisions, while it may not be thinking about, this is influencing my insurance costs, it is. So and it's only by those collective actions that we can actually help to manage those things. Otherwise, it is a cost which is going to keep going up.
Yeah. In addition to Alan's point, I would see something in the opposite way, in the sense like, let's say about this environmental projects, like insurers can underwrite some of the emerging technologies when it comes to wind turbine projects, like offshore projects, or large scale battery storage projects, or we also work on green hydrogen projects in South Australia, making some of the bankable for the investors who might otherwise see them, it could be too risky or something like that. So what we can also see from this project, as Alan was mentioning, that we can bring the industries, investors, as well as the academia together, so that we can see this as a win-win situation, where the insurance does not just cover the ESG risk, but it can also shape the market behavior or accelerate the adaptable, sustainable solutions. so which can build resilience into some of their ESG projects. And
Well, thank you very much for everyone for joining me today. That's all the questions I had for you. If anyone out in the audience has any questions for the panel, please put them into the chat now, and we'll be online for the next 20 or 30 minutes, and you can put their questions in live chat and we'll answer them. Thank you very much, everyone. It was a great chat.
Thank you.
Great to see you all.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.